So I wanted to ask you about the hero's journey. So I was first introduced to hero's journey myself back in the early 90s when I first started doing men's work and men's psychology work. So I was curious when I think I first brought the idea to you maybe 3 years ago. And what was your experience when you first looked at it and first read about it, first watched the first video about it? What was your first impression with it?
Yeah, when you first introduced me to it, we had obviously been talking about how I viewed coaching and stuff like that, like my experience and how it didn't start very well, or while it started well, I struggled at my end point in high school, and then from there I went to college, and I didn't have like the storybook Division I wrestling career, and then I found my way back to the division. So the context of my experience, you said, hey, you might be interested in Joseph Campbell's work, and then that's when you sent me the DVD. And after I watched it, it was like everything clicked, because I had come to that point of realization of what my experience was.
Okay. Was it the Finding Joe DVD?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And because before I watched that, because I'd known about him, but it all had been through different books on Campbell, and it was actually Solomon did a TED Talk, who was the director of the Finding Joe video, and that's what first got me intrigued about it. And then of course they talked about it in the TED Talk. He talked about that it was his hero's journey to do a documentary about the hero's journey, and so it gave you a context in which to kind of maybe map out what you had gone through, what you had gone through at that time period. Now, at that time, were you coaching at that time? Or were you just helping out? How was that?
No, because I came back to Rockford and I started coaching at Boiling.
Oh, that's what it was. Okay, you were at Boiling at that time. Okay, and and that was you were head coach at Boiling at that time.
Yep.
Okay, so you went from having a couple different coaching experience, obviously wrestling experience, and then you took on this team at that time that was historically had some good individual wrestlers, but not necessarily a huge culture for wrestling itself. And so, tell me a little bit about trying to take what you now had discovered yourself and the type of wrestler that you were, and then now you're in this wrestling room within a culture that didn't necessarily have the same culture that you were familiar with in high school level.
From my previous coaching experience. Yeah. I mean, after I was done and I kind of transitioned to come out here, I think I was just I was an in-between stage. I wasn't ready to coach. Mm-hmm. Like, I wasn't ready to try to build something or go through the process of doing it. And I kind of just was in that position. So coming from the other experiences, it was just it was a struggle, because I almost felt like I wasn't prepared quite yet for it. And then when I watching the hero's journey and thinking about the idea of going back out and getting information and then making the return, learning more, I didn't feel whole yet, so I didn't feel like I had complete understanding with how I wanted to coach, and so that's when we decided to leave and travel.
Sure, gotcha. So, okay.
So it was definitely a different culture, that's for sure. It didn't make it easy. But yeah, I kind of left because I looked at the difficulty and I was like, okay, I'm not ready for this, because the previous place, it was, everything was working with each other, and I was going up against a culture that obviously was at the school, but we can obviously talk further about the idea that the culture within the community is kind of still trying to find itself. To reference Finding Joe, it doesn't realize that it's the statue made of gold, right? So I think the community and the culture still struggles with the historical past a little bit too much, and that's what kind of really pushed us away to go find out more information, whether it was we needed to go somewhere else to live or we needed to find some more information. I knew that I needed to go back into the woods and learn more about myself and about what I wanted to do. Like we talked in the last time we sat down, like I needed to find out what I was here to do and to explain.
Sure. So let's spend a couple minutes just doing an overlay for individuals that may not fully grasp the hero's journey, or be familiar with the hero's journey. In this idea of Joseph Campbell's work, who studied, he was an anthropologist, historian, anthropologist, studied myths, all these different cultures, all these different civilizations, and he found this common theme within all these different ancient stories, right? Well, they're ancient stories and then also common stories, modern stories, that there was this theme, and that was kind of like in a circular motion, and I think that's definitely important for us to come back and revisit that. But this idea that you start wherever you're at, this ordinary, wherever ordinary is for you, and this idea of getting a call. And typically when we get this call, at least in my experience, has always been there's a resistance to that call. There's a refusal for that first call. I know in my case it was, are you kidding me? It's way out of my comfort zone. Though it very much may be exactly what I need to do and exactly what I've been wanting to do. But that fear of what if, it seems to lie there. But ultimately this call then leads to the separation, which is the first phase of going through, of separating from the ordinary, separating from wherever you're at to this next place, and then you cross this threshold, and that's what refer to as you refer to the woods, or could be the dark night of the soul, or the belly of the whale. It has many different forms, and there is where we face the mirror, face our own dragons, face our own whatever those things that are holding us back from being who we were originally designed to be. But we also aren't doing it alone. There's mentors, teachers, guides, helpers that come into this. But there's this idea of when we're in the woods that metaphorically there's some kind of death that's going to happen. In the Christian spirituality, it's that part of the story where you have to die of self to be born anew, and then you move on to the next aspect of your life, which is then the third. So that second phase is initiation, and then the third is this return home. So what has been learned, the gold that has been mined, that has whatever that's been achieved, whatever has been realized, is then to return and bring back to the people, back to the community at whole, and that in itself is a whole process of how am I going to do this? How am I going to bring it back? Are they going to accept it when I bring it back? Just as, again, using that Christian spirituality story, is that, well, what good can come from Nazareth? And that when Jesus returns with this new way of doing spirituality, they were like, you can't be the Son of God. We know who your father was. We know who your mother was, as if it was literal, not of what he had evolved into, right? And so this idea of this circle for you, you talked about a couple different things. Last time we were here, you talked about recognizing that the programs that you were at University of Illinois and the University of Nebraska, this honor that for some people that is the gold ring, just to be able to wrestle at the D1 level, and for you it was not what it was supposed to be. I just recently came across something that was a quote from Jim Carrey. He goes, "I wish," something to this, I'm going to tear it up, but something to this effect. "I wish everyone could be rich and famous so that they would know that it's not all that's cracked up to be." And I think that sometimes that happens, right? We get to where, okay, this is what we wanted, and then we get there and like, I don't know, and so that was a journey, right? I mean, that was part of it, and
absolutely,
and that was one part of that idea of maybe even that was the first time, or maybe not the first time, but that was one of the times that you went through this process of
absolutely. I mean, when I my first experience with knowing that it wasn't going as planned, it was very interesting, and I even had an experience a couple weeks ago that I had talked to somebody that I have known for a long time, and they know me through the sport, right? So if not 100%, 98 to 99% of my interactions with them is around the sport of wrestling. So my identity is wrapped up with wrestling. So the first time that I basically didn't want to do it in the way in which everybody was telling me I had to do it, I really had to let go of the identity of who I was. And this was extremely important, because if I never, I remember one of my first years in college at University of Illinois, I was still a little class clown, I guess if you will. Like I really wasn't focused on my academics. I wasn't focused on education. I wasn't focused on experience outside of wrestling. And so when things were struggling academically for me, I was like, I'm here to wrestle. I'm not here to be anything else. And we could go into detail about how that was reinforced by the athletic department, whether it was you have required practice schedules, right? If you did struggle with academics, they would tell you to switch your major so that you could make sure and be eligible and capable of getting to all the workouts and stuff like that. So the Division I atmosphere is pretty contradicting for me, because it takes a special individual to go into that environment with the wide range of goals and aspirations, because if you go in assuming you're a student or assuming you're an athlete, they really try to remind you that you're there to be an athlete, which is understandable. I mean, you're getting a scholarship to compete, but at the same time, you have other obligations. So it's a hypocritical. It's a bit of a hypocritical thing, but regardless, when I was going through those first struggles, I started to have to look myself in the mirror and say, hey, you better be something more than just a wrestler.
Sure.
If this wrestling thing isn't going to work out, if you don't want to be the person that everybody else wants you to be, then you have to develop in all areas.
Yeah. So it's interesting when you just were saying that at that moment, 19, 20 years old, however you were, you get a snapshot or a taste or a glimpse that this idea, this activity, this sport, right, is really a metaphor for life. You're training, you're doing all these things for this thing, of course, to win, right, and to become continually better. But really, it's metaphorical. It's a a pattern in which then you take it, because at some point, you and I've talked about this before, at some point you're going to stop wrestling. The physical part of you competing is going to come to an end, or at least it's going to come to an end in that fashion. I mean, I guess some of them continue with professional wrestling and that element from an entertainment standpoint versus the competitive. But even then, what small percentage of them go on and wrestle internationally or wrestle continually through in their 30s and 40s? But even then, at some point, it comes to an end of physically competing. And if you haven't created anything more than that identity, you're just delaying accepting the call.
Yeah, no, I've seen it time and time again with so many kids and like coaches that I've seen. They stay in that realm, and for me, it was really like knowing the small percentage of people that go to the Division I level in the first place to wrestle, and then seeing how many people who never had achieved those goals almost feel like they felt pity or sorry for you because it didn't work out or it wasn't working out or you didn't want. And I was always confused, like, very few people do what I'm doing, and I don't want to do it anymore, but yet I still am viewed as somebody who somehow isn't working out. So
sure.
Yeah, I mean, it was a learning experience, but I'm super grateful that it didn't work out. I mean, there's many reasons why it didn't work out, but the fact that it didn't, because I wasn't passionate about it, I knew that I needed to look inward and look for other things. But yeah.
Well, and I think that's a big reason why I wanted to, for us to start this conversation about the hero's journey, is this initial part, I guess we could say phase one of the 3 phases of the hero's journey, is this idea of separation. Because I think it can come in many different forms, right? It can come from something dramatic happening, like an accident or a divorce or, a breakup or a removal from school, an arrest, different things like that. Or it could happen with this idea of, like you had said, I don't know, I'm becoming disillusioned with this. It's losing its sparkle, and in those, there's the beginning of something's about to begin, right?
Yeah.
And so I think either way, I guess though, I think it's real important that we, because we're both former competitors, right? And even from a coaching, from a fan standpoint, we both respect and honor the competitiveness in watching athletes and different things like that. And I think it's important, and obviously disagree with me, but this idea that if you are going to do it, then do it at 100%. I mean, pursue it as if that you're going to be that 0.5% that's going to make it. Because to not do it, I think, is worse.
Yeah.
If that's what you think you're being called to do, I think it's...
Well, this is one of the reasons why I was so excited that you reached out to talk about this specific topic, because personally, talking about my experience, my personal experience to chase becoming the best wrestler in the state of Illinois in high school, that was a hero's journey. That was a goal and aspiration to do. And then when that failed and that came to a close, I went to college, but at that time, it was really the end of one and the beginning of another journey, right? And I can vividly remember experiences, and maybe the call came, the call comes knocking, right? At first, you hear the call, and then you might ignore it fully, and then you hear the call, you might ignore it, and then you hear a call again, and it's like, hey, you better take this opportunity. And like growing up, my first wrestling match, I lost, and it was devastating, and I hated the embarrassment that I felt from losing. I was 6 years old, and I lost like some ridiculous match. Like there was no skill involved, but I remember losing. I didn't like it, and so then I set out and I just went to practice for like 2 years. I never went to a competition. I just practiced, and it was something that was fixated in my head with like, okay, I'm gonna get good at this, right? And then I got better and better and better, but then I struggled with other sports, baseball and football. I was always a smaller kid, but I was very aggressive and very strong for my age. But yet coaches were, they were parents, and they were people that didn't know my potential, so they assumed what I had to offer was based on my size and stature, so that I found myself getting pushed away. And that was the call. I mean, I can vividly remember an experience that I was playing baseball, and I had started every single inning in baseball, and at the end of the year they selected all-star team, and the coaches sat me down and said, hey, we're gonna put so-and-so on the all-star team instead of you. And they tried to break it to me nice, but the dad was one of the coaches, and he didn't play as much as me, so how could he be on an all-star team if he didn't even play as much as me? And so it was that moment that I was like, I will never do a sport where other people are in control. And from that moment, I just said, I'm going to become the best wrestler in this town, and I'm just going to become the best. And I'm going to win a state title, and I'm going to break the records in high school. And those were those were the calls that really just said, hey, go do it. And that initiated the process.
So one of the things that I do a lot of speaking on is this idea of resiliency and developing resiliency, and one of the things that we talk about with helping facilitate that within students, within individuals, is this idea of moving from an external locus of control, a victim stance, this is being done to me, to an internal locus of control. What am I going to do about what's happened, right? So how old were you when you were telling that story about the baseball story?
6th grade. 7th grade. 7th grade was the last year.
So maybe 11, 12.
Yep.
Something like that. And so at 12 years old, let's say, you made a decision that this happened, right, based upon other people making a choice. You easily could have taken the temptation of saying it was done to you. Yeah. And then gone victim, and then try to get somebody to advocate for you or to do something different about that. Or you made a decision, I am going to focus on putting my destiny in my own hands. And I mean, I know you didn't use those words at that time, but this idea of you were going to go, what can I control myself? I can control amount of effort that I put into this, how much I discipline myself. I can control if I win or lose from that element of it, and not necessarily being if I'm selected or not. Because it's interesting when you talk about that. I think wrestling is similar to maybe swimming, maybe another one that's similar to this, is that you, and I think track, you are selected for all state based upon your placement at the state tournament, not based upon other people's opinion about how well you played. Is that true? Yeah. So it is interesting how.
I don't know how. Because it's never a pinpoint to one exact example, but growing up, I know my dad used to always tell us as kids that we could be as good as anybody else, that nobody else possessed anything special. We could be the best at whatever we wanted to do if we were willing to do the things. I remember hearing that a lot. Going through grade school, whether it was tag in gym class or a game of horse, I was extremely competitive. So I developed a competitive spirit throughout my upbringing because of the standard that my parents set. That you can always be the best if you want to be. And so just hearing that over and over again, I think developed the resiliency to giving myself the victor mindset versus feeling that, again, going back to the reason why I was super excited that you reached out to me is I was just talking to my high school wrestling team the other day, and I was asking them about goals and goal setting and what they believe they could achieve, and again trying to put the call, like, see your potential is something, specifically, I have other coaches that say, make sure you make realistic goals and don't make unrealistic goals. And I tell the kids, I say, that's a lie. There is no such thing as an unrealistic goal. What he meant to say was that he doesn't believe that you're willing to put in the work that's required to achieve that goal. That's why he said it's unrealistic. He didn't believe in you. If he told me that when I was a kid, then I would never have made the unrealistic goals that I eventually accomplished. Mm-hmm. So the idea of an unrealistic goal is predicated upon the person who says it's unrealistic. If they say it's unrealistic, what they're really saying is that they don't believe you're willing to do what's required to accomplish it. And so I was talking to my wrestlers, and they're starting to tell me goals as if they're jokes. And I never have ever looked at a goal as a joke. Mm-hmm. Like I've never said I could do something and then not believed it.
Right.
I wouldn't have said it if I didn't believe that I could do it. And I think a lot of kids are, at least the kids that I'm interacting with as of recent, are being taught that if they say something, other people are laughing, and they're believing those other people. When my parents never said, "Oh, you're going to do that," but they never said, "Ha, I don't believe that." Mm-hmm. Right? They supported those things. The people around me supported those things. Said, "You can do it, but it's going to be tough." Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that's why I was really excited about this, because the call is so. I mean, every single person that goes out for a sport is getting the call.
Right.
Why are they there?
Right.
It's a call. I don't know what got them to make the decision to go out for the team, or get into the club, or whatever the call was. From that moment, it's their decision whether or not they answer it. And obviously, like you said, answering it is going for it.
Sure.
Not going just to be involved.
Do you think, like in this particular case, this particular adult, this coach, whoever, about the idea of have realistic goals, is it possible that that's coming from his own fear of his own not being able, his own fear that he's not going to attain certain goals, and he doesn't want to be disappointed, and so then he projects that onto the student athlete?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that is one component, absolutely. If you don't believe in yourself, it's going to be hard for you to believe in other people. Mm-hmm. Two, I just think, much like we're talking about resilience, right? So if somebody possesses resilience, they won't become cynical over time because of certain outcomes. It's a small percentage of people who actually answer the call. Yeah. And so if a small percentage of people actually answer the call, over time, if you do it for a long time, you're going to think that nobody's going to do it.
Right. So
you become cynical. So I think, in one sense, absolutely, it's his own insecurities projecting out to the students, as is the parents and any friends that are around doing that as well. But I really think a lot of it has to do with how people become cynical over time because they see little to no change of behavior.
So it's interesting. I was doing some looking at some research that's on the brain, and they were saying that the brain, when as they measure the brain waves of the movement in the brain, what it's firing and stuff, that when there is a perceived threat, a real or perceived threat, the brain fires a certain way. When an individual is being negative, critical, or cynical, the brain fires the same as if it's being threatened. So negativity and fear, the brain is responding the same way. It's responding in the fight and flight scenario. And so I know as a therapist, many times underneath that iceberg of criticism and negativity is some fear that I don't want to be disappointed. If I'm angry about it, if I'm being negative about it, then I don't have to talk and be vulnerable about my fear, because I'm so uncomfortable with being disappointed. And the longer I stay away from it, the more uncomfortable I'm going to be. You said something earlier, and I thought of a couple of different stories with my son who he wrestled and he played hockey, but his main sport was football. And there was two stories. One, that you talked about this idea of someone speaking into you, kind of like your father spoke into you. And I didn't even know that what I was doing at the time. But Caleb was in 5th grade. He played defensive back, and he was pretty quick for his age. And in one of the plays, wide receiver, caught the ball, and Caleb chased after him, caught him from behind from scoring a touchdown, right? And we were leaving, said, Caleb, you need to know that whenever you choose to, you will always catch someone from behind. No matter what, if you choose to, you will always catch someone from behind. And then consequently, when he was in middle school, he did. And when he was in high school, he did. And when he was in college, he did. It was when he chose to, he could catch whoever it was from behind. And that idea of being spoken into, I think there's an element of that. I know that there were certain individuals in my life that spoke into that. Along that same idea, Caleb was, he was a freshman, first year of football. I remember the summer he'd gone to practice and gone to summer, not practice, but summer workouts. And I said, so how does it look? What are you thinking? Stuff like that. And he goes, I'm going to start this year. And I was like, dude, in my mind, I'm like, you're a freshman. I said, yeah, special teams, man, that's a great place to start. He goes, no, I'm starting on the defense. And I was like, and I remember catching myself and not saying anything. Inside me, I was like, dude, that's a pretty big, hairy, audacious goal, man. That's a pretty big one. And for him, the idea was that it was all about effort. He ends up going out. The team preseason ranking for that defense that year was 11th in the nation. He ended up being a starting cornerback. He was the only freshman in conference that started that year. It literally was based on attitude. Granted, he was fast. He knew football. He had good football IQ. But he believed that there's no reason why I can't start. Yeah. And so I think there's something about that element, and again, that idea of accepting that call, accepting that, because for him to, just like yourself, to leave high school, it could be done then. He could be finished there, but to accept that next call at that next level, well, you're starting all over. No one knows you. It doesn't matter what you've done in the past. Now you're starting over again. And similar to you, after his second year of wrestling, or second year of playing football, he said, I'm done. And it was a combination of reasons, I think, but ultimately it was, he was tired of it. It wasn't the same for him anymore, and he didn't have the same hunger for it as he did going into his freshman year when he was announcing, only to me, he wasn't announcing to anyone else, but that he was going to start, and so I think this idea of, similar to when you're working with those young people, of putting that call out there, setting those expectations of a goal, that we don't want, it's like that idea, the difference between a goal and a mission, right? A goal is something that you're going to attain. A mission is something that you're going to live for. And it's not going to be something you're going to attain in this lifetime. And being able to pursue something, and if it's out of your comfort zone, it's about that journey. The journey to attain something outside of your reach, you're going to get much more out of that than if you set low-hanging goals. There's not even a good story there. There's not even a good story.
Yeah, that's where I led into speaking about with my team is the idea that you're going to create goals, and when you actualize those goals, you become somebody different. You become somebody who can create new goals, because you can't make all of these goals. It's one of the reasons why I'm trying to encourage so many young people to answer the call for sports, because it's a time, when you're an adolescent into high school, you have that time to do something, right? And sports are part of our culture. It's part of what we do to fill time while we're young.
Right.
What I wish I could fully do is to explain that it's not that I think wrestling or basketball or football or another sport is uniquely better than another. It's that I think that if you choose to be honest with yourself and pursue your highest level of ability within those sporting opportunities, you become somebody uniquely different that you would have never been able to become if you didn't try to do that. You won't go through the adversity, right? Like if you don't try to become the best, well, then you'll have less adversity, right? You'll question yourself a lot less if you're not trying to attain something that's very difficult to attain. So, I tried to explain that it's not that becoming a state champion is the most important thing in the world, and if you don't attain it, I didn't attain it, I lost, but my effort, trying to win a high school state title, was something that, looking back, I put so much work into, like so much work. And looking back, that's what made me who I am today. And if I didn't try to do that, I would not be who I am today. Like, it just I wouldn't be that person. Now, I don't know what else I would have went down, and I can't rewrite my experience, but I just know how beneficial it was for me to answer that call, no matter how difficult it was along the way. I was never undefeated, so it was never perfect. I woke up every day aspiring to be better than I was the day before. I had this idea that I always thought, like, I want to try to get there tomorrow, but I know that it might take a while. I knew that I wanted to win a state title, but I wanted to try to get there tomorrow.
Sure.
And with that attitude, I just put as much work in as possible. I lifted up every rock that I could find. I asked as many questions as I could. And that was the thing that has led me to becoming a person that I think, when in that need of, I want to say, reinvention, it was easy for me. We're doing a podcast right now, but because I was willing to put in that work, I dove into education. I don't think I read probably more than 3 books up until I was 22, but then after that I read so many.
Sure. Yeah.
Because it's work, and if you're not passionate about the things that you're doing, you don't want to do it. So I wasn't really passionate about it growing up, about reading, about I wasn't trying to read philosophy when I was 16 years old.
Sure.
I wasn't trying to read about world religions. I wasn't trying to read about millionaires or billionaires explaining how they've gone through their life and experiences. I wasn't trying to do that. Right. But after wrestling was over, and I was looking into this new this new avenue of who I wanted to become, I was curious, and that curiosity led me to putting in the work, and then finding enjoyment through it.
So one other piece I want to make sure we touch on here, again, with this first phase of the idea of separation from whatever the normal is, that call that comes out. This idea of when we get the call, right? So it may be planted. So you talked about there was different things that your parents did, maybe more specifically your dad did, of talking about you can be the best. You could be good at something if you put forth effort. It's up to you. And there was this idea of self-discipline, this idea of your effort that you put into it, that they coincided with each other, right? And then and so those were some definite seeds that were planted, some modeling that was going on. And then it was easy probably at that time, because sports are a way of doing that, because our options are fairly limited when we're a young person. If we're going to be competitive, what different avenues are we going to be competitive in? Sports is probably the easiest, especially in the Midwest. And so this idea of being competitive, and then it sounded like this idea that happened when you were playing baseball, that you had this experience of when you first started wrestling, and you felt and tasted what it was like to lose that match or that kid wrestling program, and then you practice to get better for a couple years. So then you're wrestling for a while, and then you go out for baseball. You do well in it against, so to speak, the odds, because you've stature and all those things. But then not getting selected for an all-star team, and of course it's 7th grade all-star, and of course it means everything in the world at that time. Of course, now, having experienced a lot of other things, it may not have been the biggest thing in the world. There was another element of determining, all right, I'm going to do this, and you put that, what appeared, put that mindset into wrestling. Many times, though, before we take the call, there's fear. It's why we don't leave normal. That's why we don't leave the ordinary. That's why we don't leave our mother's bosom. That's why we don't leave the safety of that family house. There's this fear. If you think back on it, what was that fear? If there was a fear, well, no, not if. If you can identify what the fear was at that time period, it probably carried through in grade school, middle school, high school. There was some element of fear, because that's what you're being called into. What was the fear? Yeah,
as you were talking, I was thinking about the ego, because I think ego gets a bad rap sometimes, right? Like, because if you have an ego, it's bad. But if you don't have an ego, you're good. And I think the ego is so important for us as creatures to develop our understanding of it and how to use it most effectively. If you don't have an ego of some kind, I'm not saying it's not in check or understood, you'll probably not try to aspire to be better than other people.
Sure.
Because I think for me personally, it was an ego thing as well, trying to I don't want to say embarrassed, but I was annoyed that, as a little kid, everything that I was doing wasn't good enough, that other people somehow were getting opportunities over me. And so it developed a chip on my shoulder. Like, I wanted to prove that I was worthy, that I knew that I was good and capable of being better than everybody else, right? So a lot of my call, or at least willingness to try to chase that potential, was based on ego. And I think my fear was not achieving that, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think a lot of my fear was like, I don't want, like, I had a strong ego of, I can do this, and if I failed, it was not going to feel good. And physical stuff was easy. Mm-hmm. Like, it never bothered me at all to train hard. I loved training hard. As you know, like, after you get in shape, after you get your body like developing, like, it's a drug itself. It feels good. It doesn't feel bad to train hard when you're training hard.
Right.
It feels bad if you've never trained hard and then you train hard. That doesn't feel good at all.
Sure.
But if you're, an athlete, I mean, training is actually, more of a drug than it is a hindrance. So, for me, I think getting started, it had a lot to do with my pride. I had a lot of pride in myself, and the ego was pushing me to be worthy of other people's praise, I guess. And the fear, I think about, I did not want to lose. Mm-hmm. Because when I lost, I hated when people felt sorry for me. Mm-hmm. And I felt like that was such a blow to my ego in many ways, that people were, oh, I'm sorry to hear it, you lost. Oh, that's tough, and that bothered me so much. That fear of feeling like that, I think, had a lot to do with really making the call. Because again, this is, fast forward, that was something that I had to deal with. Mm-hmm. That I've learned about, and like, I've been able to, I don't want to say cope, but I don't care as much as I used to if somebody says, oh, it didn't work out. It's like, yeah, it didn't work out.
So here's the interesting thing about that part is that, and I think it's important for people to fully grasp, right? So like in our case, we're looking backwards and looking at telling the story from the beginning of the book, right? And looking at it. But I think for a teaching point and learning point for other individuals as they're going through different things, and being able to name that fear, right? And so there's some element of, in itself, strength and power that comes from naming that fear, or that thing that I think another phrase that we use is either you're chasing after a dragon or you're being chased by a dragon, and which is it? And so, or in some ways, it may be both. It may be a tension between the two. I know for me, and maybe this, at least it sounds similar to what you were saying, is I remember being invisible. I clearly remember being overlooked, and what it was like to not be selected in the first 5 of the 15 boys picked when we were playing kickball at recess. And I remember that feeling. And at the same time, I'd be picked first later on, and I would downplay it. So there was this element that I didn't want to be picked. I didn't want to be invisible. And then there was that other part that inside I knew that in itself wasn't everything. But I know for me that was an element, and it sounds like very similar to yourself, of those were experiences that didn't just come from one particular person. Right? It was a cumulative that you wanted, you were driven to address, and there was opportunities where you could have gone victim, just turned it over to, I have no control over it. These are outside circumstances. I can't do anything about my height. I can't do anything about these things. And in this element that taking it to that next level, that call of how can I find out? And those were some of the things that we're going to talk about in the future, about this idea of what happens in initiation, what happens when we separate and we cross that threshold. It's the same things that we were aware of in the initial part, in the normal, those fears, those concerns, those things we don't want other people to know about us. You're right. It all lies psychologically in our ego. It without a doubt, it lies there. And I think you're right too. The ego is not. it's not good or bad. It is good and bad. It's not both. I mean, it is both. It's not one or the other. That this idea, it's about living within the tension, living in the dance of that, and being aware that, like anything, like food, too much of it, there's going to be a problem. And
yeah, I mean, when I think of the ego, it's just that I think of it as a, I won't say like the dog that's constantly wandering in your body, right? Like it can get wild and it can run away, or and you have to notice it and train it and focus it. You mentioned the habitual nature of negativity, right? Like as you become negative, you start to enjoy the negativity, right? And so I think that's a person that's unaware that they're capable of enjoying negativity, right? Like the ego is at least the idea of the ego is cool because you at least acknowledge that there's something, right? And that's why I don't think you should say it's good or bad. I think you should just say it, because then you can address it and understand that, oh, maybe I'm going down, maybe that's not productive. Because ultimately it's all about productivity. How is it helping you become a better version of yourself? Because like I said, the ego that fuels the pride, I mean, that's not always a negative thing, right? And I think that's also why in society we see people with not what we would deem as a healthy ego, simply because some of what society allows is those negative aspects of the ego to self-fulfill themselves. You can do really well and not have a balanced approach to your ego, I guess is what I'm saying. So as long as you take away certain societal things like wealth or power, or these types of things of that are constructs of our society that we live in, and then you look at the ego, I think you can do a better job. But you can be very arrogant and prideful, and it can serve you well, but it might not serve you well from a balanced approach, like you were talking about.
Well, and I think ultimately, it's this idea of success, whatever that is deemed as success, may not be growth.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly.
And growth in development by some may not be considered success
in society
or by certain measurements. But ultimately, whenever we grow and develop, it is ultimately always about giving back to others, giving back to the community as a whole, to the planet, to other people. And that in itself is life-giving. That in itself is going to continue inviting other people into it, and continue that element of you yourself. It's self-sustaining, right? Yeah. And where some definitions of success may not be self-sustaining. It may be a one and done, and that in itself is an interesting story. And so, well, I definitely would want to continue our conversation, and maybe the next time we get together, or definitely the next time we get together, I'd like to talk about this idea of crossing that threshold and then going into the initiation, and what that is like, and what that was like for you, and what that's like for you now as a coach with some of your young guys. So
absolutely, thanks, man.
Thanks, Dalton.
Will do.
All right.